At the top of the mountains, shrouded in mist, lived an old master named Genro. His wooden cabin stood next to a narrow path, barely visible among the stones and twisted trees. Many said this path led nowhere, but every morning, Genro walked it slowly and steadily, as if every stone knew its place. One day, a young man arrived, exhausted, his feet covered in dust and his eyes heavy with questions. He knelt before Genro and said, "Master, I have walked for days without direction. Every time I think I'm advancing, the path turns, forks, or brings me back to the beginning. How will I know if I'm on the right path?" Genro observed him silently and offered him a cup of hot tea. Then, he pointed with his finger to a gentle curve in the path before them. "That turn you despise," he said in a measured voice, "is part of the journey. Sometimes we don't see it because we expect straight lines, but the path doesn't go wrong. We just don't yet understand its dance." The young man frowned. "What if I've wasted my time on this journey?" The master smiled. "Didn't you make it here?" The wind blew through the trees, as if the forest wanted to add something more. The young man drank the tea in silence. The warmth brought him some clarity, but his heart still weighed heavy. His thoughts swirled like leaves in a whirlwind. Past decisions, paths not taken, places he had left behind in search of answers. "Master," he finally said, "what if I was wrong to leave home? What if all of this has been a mistake?" Genro slowly rose and walked to a smooth rock covered in moss. With his hand, he brushed aside some fallen leaves and revealed a small inscription carved into the stone. A simple circle. The old man looked at the young man and said, "There are no mistakes on the path, only moments you don't yet understand." The young man approached and gently traced the carving. "But sometimes I feel like I keep returning to the same point, over and over." Genro nodded. "Like the seasons, like the sun that sets only to rise again. The path turns, not to confuse you, but to transform you. What you think is repetition is maturation. Each turn brings you with new eyes." The young man lowered his gaze. He had never considered that the turn could also be a lesson. In that moment, a bird flew across the sky and disappeared into the trees, like a sign of something he still couldn't name. The sun was beginning to set behind the mountains, painting the sky a soft orange. Genro stood up and pointed to the path that disappeared into the bushes. "Come," he said calmly. "Let's walk a little." The young man followed him in silence. With each step, the path seemed to narrow and then open up again, as if it were breathing with them. They climbed and descended hills, crossed streams, and avoided roots that rose from the earth like unanswered questions. "Have you always lived here, master?" the young man asked. "Since I stopped looking for a better place," Genro replied. The young man looked at him, surprised. "And how did you know this was the right place?" The old man smiled and tapped a stone on the ground with his staff. "I didn't know. I just stopped running. The place stopped being important, and the path became clear." They continued walking. Suddenly, the path split into 3 directions. The young man stopped, confused. "Which one do we take?" Genro shrugged. "Any. They all lead to yourself." Night began to cover the forest with its deep blue cloak. The master and the young man chose a path without discussion, as if their feet knew something that the mind had yet to understand. The silence between them was not uncomfortable, but serene, as if the path spoke for both of them. After a while, the young man broke the silence. "Sometimes it feels like life gives me tests I don't understand. People who leave, opportunities that disappear, decisions that don't turn out as I expected." Genro nodded calmly. "All of that is part of the path too. You don't see it now, but later, when you look back, you'll notice how each turn had its place. What seems like a loss now might have been space for something new." The young man sighed. What if I never understand? The master stopped and looked up at the stars. Then trust. The young man also lifted his gaze. The stars twinkled in silence, like ancient lanterns hung by a greater will. In that moment, something inside him relaxed, not because he understood, but because he gently surrendered to not understanding. And in that surrender, for the first time in a long while, the path seemed less heavy. That night, they camped by a small stream. Genro lit a fire with dry branches, and as the flames danced, the young man watched how the shadows were cast over the rocks, distorting what he thought he knew. "Master," he said in a low voice, "how can I know when to act and when to wait?" Genro tossed a twig into the fire and replied, "The bamboo doesn't push the wind, yet it always finds its shape." The young man frowned, thoughtful. "So, should I let life decide for me?" "It's not about surrendering to chance," the master explained. "It's about refining your listening. The path speaks, but it speaks in whispers. When we force, we stop hearing. When we flow, we understand effortlessly." The fire crackled as if confirming his words. "But there are times when everything seems confusing," the young man said. "What if there are no signs?" Genro settled on a rock and fixed his gaze on the flames. "When there are no signs, walk in peace. Not knowing is also part of the journey. You are not lost. You just haven't yet reached the turn that gives meaning to this stretch." The young man looked at the fire, more silent than ever, and inside something began to burn. Not as fear, but as a small certainty that maybe, right there where he was already part of the destiny he was seeking. At dawn, the mist covered the path like a sacred veil. Genro and the young man resumed their walk without exchanging words. There was a new stillness between them, a kind of silent trust that could be felt in every step. They walked until they reached an intersection in the middle of the forest. 3 completely different paths lay before them. One straight and clear, another steep and rocky, and a third barely visible, covered in underbrush. The young man stopped. He looked at each one attentively, then looked at the master. "Which one would you choose?" Genro did not answer. He crouched down, took a handful of earth, and let it fall through his fingers. Then he stood up and said, "The path you choose will be the right one, if you walk it with presence." The young man lowered his gaze. "And what if I regret it?" Genro gently touched his shoulder. "Regret only arises when you believe the path should have been different. But it wasn't. That was you too, seeking your shape." The young man took a deep breath. For the first time, he didn't choose in haste. He didn't choose out of fear or desire. He just took one step, only one. And the earth beneath his feet seemed to support him like never before. Genro smiled, as if the forest had just whispered a secret to him. The new path wound between ancient trees, whose branches seemed to whisper stories of other travelers. Sometimes the path rose sharply, other times it descended without warning. In certain stretches, it completely disappeared, as if challenging the traveler to continue with faith. The young man stumbled once, then again. But he no longer cursed the stumbles. Each stone taught him something. Each root spoke to him of attention. Each turn, once feared, became an opportunity to see the forest from a different angle. At one of these bends, they found a hidden waterfall. The water fell forcefully, but when it touched the pond, it slid with an indescribable smoothness. The young man sat in front of it and asked, "Master, how will I know when I have arrived?" Genro sat beside him. He watched the water in silence before responding. "It's not about arriving. It's about being. The path has no goal, only moments. And this one," he said, pointing to the present, "is already one of them." The young man closed his eyes. For the first time, he was not searching for anything. He simply listened to the murmur of the water, the wind through the leaves, and the calm beating of his own heart. 3 days passed before the young man said goodbye to the master. He carried no maps or clear destination, only a new calm that guided his steps. "Will I see you again, master?" he asked at the edge of the path. Genro looked at him tenderly. "Every time you listen in silence, I will be there. Not because you remember me, but because you are already part of the path." The young man nodded, and this time he asked no more questions. He turned on his heels and began to walk, knowing that each step, however uncertain it seemed, was exactly right. As he disappeared among the trees, Genro murmured to himself, "The path never makes a mistake. We are the ones who take time to see that each turn was always part of the plan." The breeze moved the leaves, the sky opened a strip of light between the clouds, and the path, eternal and patient, closed once again behind the traveler, as if it had fulfilled its teaching. And on the mountain, only silence remained, as wise and serene as the path itself.